This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. Senator John Ensign of Nevada and South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford have something in common, in addition to both being Republicans who confess to out-of-wedlock affairs. They're connected to a Christian group known as the Family or the Fellowship. Ensign lives in a house on C Street in Washington, D.C. that's registered as a church and is owned by a foundation affiliated with the group. In Sanford's press conference about his affair, he said he'd worked with C Street, which he described as a Christian Bible study group. Usually between 5 and 8 lawmakers live at the house on C Street. If you've never heard of C Street or the Family, it's perhaps because the Family prefers it that way. It's a pretty secretive group, but very powerful. The longtime leader, Doug Coe, was included in Time magazine's 2004 list of the 25 most influential evangelicals in America. Coe was described as the stealth Billy Graham, specializing in the spiritual struggles of the powerful. My guest, Jeff Sharlet, is the author of the book, The Family, The Secret Fundamentalism at the Heart of American Power. It just came out in paperback. Sharlet is a contributing editor for Harper's and Rolling Stone and an associate research scholar at NYU's Center for Religion and Media. Jeff Sharlet, welcome to Fresh Air. What is the Family or the Fellowship's idea of Christianity that it's trying to spread?
Well, it's a very unusual organization, so much so that some traditional Christian right organizations consider it heretical. It goes back to this vision that the founder, Norwegian immigrant named Abraham Vereide, has in 1935 in the midst of the Great Depression. And he believes that God comes to him first in the person of James Farrell, who was then the head of U.S. Steel. And Vereide was sort of at that time already a prominent minister, so he was traveling in those circles, and reveals to him that the Great Depression, that all economic suffering is a punishment for disobedience of God's laws. So any kind of New Deal is not the way to go. And then God gives him a second revelation, which is that Christianity has been getting it wrong for 2,000 years. At its best, talks about the poor, the weak, the suffering, the down and out. And he believes that God tells him, very literally, using these words, Abram, your mission is to serve the up and out, those who are already powerful. And if you can get their hearts right with God, then they, in their positions of power that God has placed them in, will dispense blessings to those underneath them. One Senate staffer who had been affiliated with the group for a while described it, I think, very aptly as a sort of a trickle-down fundamentalism.
So the Fellowship or the Family, that's why it ministers to powerful people like congressmen and senators.
Yeah, absolutely. And congressmen and senators, foreign leaders, what they want is, in one document, it says, we are trying to build a family of world leaders who are bound privately through our networks with this particular understanding of Christianity. And that if we can just do that, we'll be able to, bring peace to the world, free markets, which they equate with Christianity, and all these other blessings that they tend to also conflate with American power.
Now, what's the connection in the philosophy of the Family between free markets, capitalism, and Christianity?
You go back to this moment in the Great Depression that I described, where they see this as a sort of punishment from God for what they see as sort of a sin of socialism. The attempts to regulate the market are prideful. In other words, the invisible hand, they take that very literally, the invisible hand of capitalism. They say what you have is an invisible hand through which God touches the hearts of corporate titans, leaders, and so on. And they then run their companies. And the Family began primarily as a union-busting organization. That was their sort of first mission. They were terrified of organized labor in the 1930s. But they tapped into this older American tradition that really goes back to something in the 19th century called the businessman's revival. This idea that if you have Christian men of business and Christian politicians and so on, you don't need laws to protect the poor because they will protect the poor. It's this very paternalistic and potentially very dangerous tradition because, of course, it leads you away from accountability. If we say we don't have regulation, we don't have oversight, we don't have laws, we just have God operating in the heart of these powerful men, well, we're left without a lot of recourse when a powerful man like, say, Governor Sanford or Senator Ensign goes off the rails.
So what about the values agenda that has been so important to the Republican Party in the past few years? Does the Family emphasize an anti-gay agenda, anti-abortion, pro-celibacy, pro abstinence-only education, I should say. Are they supporters of that values agenda in addition to emphasizing the more capitalist approach?
Yes, but not rigidly and only secondarily. To them, the idea of free markets working through elites, building these networks of elites, that's the top concern. So Doug Coe, the longtime leader of the group, I sat in one time on a meeting between Doug Coe, the leader, and Congressman Todd Tiahrt of Kansas. And Todd Tiahrt was sort of there, almost sort of auditioning to get involved in this thing, and he was trying to show off, his dedication to those kinds of meat and potatoes Christian right issues. And he was talking about the threat of Islam and talking about abortion. And Doug Coe, he doesn't necessarily disagree with this sort of line of thinking. He sort of nods his head and says, "Yeah, that's fine, but you're really thinking very small." He says, these are hot button issues. He says the real work of the kind of governance that we're after is what he calls Jesus plus nothing. And Jesus plus nothing means actually Jesus plus everything. It means everything gets filtered through Jesus. And the examples he gave, he says, what does Jesus have to say about Social Security? In the family's case, it's privatize, which is almost always their answer, is to privatize. What does Jesus have to say about building roads? What does Jesus have to say about every single issue, including in your own life? And you organize men like Sanford and Ensign, and maybe Todd Tiahrt, into prayer cells so that they can ask, what does Jesus have to say about what's in my life? And they actually give veto power over their own lives to the other men in their prayer cells. That's their language, by the way. Cell sounds like an inflammatory term, but it's actually got this old evangelical pedigree that long predates the current association.
You compare the family to, say, televangelist groups, and you say that in some ways they're at opposite poles. Like the televangelists, they want to get on TV. They want to preach to a really large audience. They want a mega church. Whereas the family, it's pretty secretive. They don't want any media attention. They don't want people to know their name. Why?
This was this man that I mentioned, the current leader, Doug Coe. This was really his insight, and it goes back to 1966. He's the second person to lead the family. The longtime leader was a founder, Abraham Vereide. And he didn't mind public attention. He really liked it to be known that he was hobnobbing with, senators and presidents and kings and that kind of thing. He knew also that you had a media at that time that didn't look too closely into the religious lives of politicians. It wasn't considered that relevant. And then you get this moment in the late 60s where two things are happening. The family's really expanding its reach into governments around the world, sort of the developing world. And they're dealing with a lot more sort of unsavory characters. And at the same time, you have a media that's suddenly moving into one of these sort of great investigative periods where the media is sort of saying, hey, we're going to ask tough questions. And if you're going to go and pray with General Suharto in Indonesia and then make an oil deal, we want to know about that. Well, so Doug Coe sends out a memo to the various congressmen and politicians involved. And he says, the time has come to submerge our public image. They got rid of letterhead. He says, from now on, when you do something through the family, don't say you're doing it through the family. Just say you're doing it yourself. And that we're going to become invisible believing groups. This is their language. It's important because when someone says invisible, it sounds kind of conspiratorial. This is their language and their documents. They thought that would make them more effective. And I always try to see it from their perspective. They do think that, look, we can do more good work for people. We can help these powerful people if we can give them a shield from the public eyes. And that's fine for a pastor and an individual, but when we're talking about political deals, it's a whole different story.